responsibility. The lowest person in your organization can take you down if they're not happy.
Right.
Right? And so I think that what people need to understand is that there is this lost art of standing with somebody that you don't 100% agree with, who says things that are like, you know, there are definitely things you do on stage that I'm not comfortable with, but if somebody comes to attack you, fundamentally, I know that all of those points I can bring up to you, you know, face to face. I assume it's true in reverse. And so this idea of standing with people, you know, Dave, you've been going down a libertarian path that I'm uncomfortable with often. But somebody says, you know,
and we hash it out publicly and privately.
Publicly and privately. And so, and there's stuff I'll do privately with you that I won't do publicly because I think that it is important to learn how to stand in units, because otherwise you just get picked off. And this is, you know, there's a topic that I want to bring up a little bit later, which is what do I think the IDW, since you discussed it, gets wrong. And one thing I think we get wrong is that the tribalism that we keep seeing is so toxic that we decide that we are anti-tribal. It's not the right model. You want to be adaptively tribal and adaptively individualistic, right? These things matter. Groups matter. Groups have specialized knowledge. Very often, you know, my group has certain stuff, your group has a different, we engage in trade. It is important to understand that tribalism can be adaptive. And so it's very troubling to me that the dumbest voices on the other side are causing us to overreact too simplistically. So standing with my brother, yeah, there's a reason that, you know, people say he's like a brother to me, because it means that you will put yourself at great risk. And you know, I've taken a lot of slings and arrows for Brett, and there's a pleasure in it. I'm not going to say that it didn't lead to sleepless nights and that I don't worry about friends that I've lost, but it's also, you know, in some sense good to know. And people respond positively because it's in our makeup to say, well, that guy didn't run from a fight.
So do we basically have to just model it out for people in our behavior? So for example, when the New York Times piece came out on you about 3 weeks ago, the enforced monogamy piece. Now the author of it, I'm not even going to mention her name, but if you want it, you can go ahead. She sat in the green room with us, I think on the first night in Toronto. She was all smiles, friendly. Yeah. You even said to me how much you like her, and you introduced me to her, and we were chatting. She seemed perfectly pleasant and lovely. And then, of course, this piece comes out. It implies that you're for forced monogamy, which why don't you just explain that real quick? Just do a 1 minute recap on what you were talking about.
The implication was, and to the degree that this has been, let's say, exaggerated in the aftermath of the piece, the implication was that I was promoting the idea that, you know, perfectly innocent women would be lined up by the state and distributed en masse to undeserving males so that they wouldn't be violent.
We've only done that at one show, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. and it didn't go that well.
It did not go well.
Yeah. So that was quite curious, because that part of the conversation I had with the journalist lasted probably 2 minutes out of what was essentially a 2-day interview, and it was obviously something that triggered her imagination, in the sense that she saw that she could use it for I don't know, for political purposes or something like that in the piece. But it was so palpably absurd because and I would say amateurish in some sense as well, because the position that she accused me of holding, I didn't hold, so that's the first problem. B, no one holds. Like, if you're going to try to pillory someone in a manner that's at least vaguely believable, you should accuse them of holding a view that at least some person has held at some point.
Right.
And no one has ever held that view. And then the other thing that was quite off-putting, let's say, is that she's not stupid. She knew perfectly well what I meant by enforced monogamy, by the term. It's an anthropological term. It's been used for 100 years. And the idea that polygamous societies, which would be the contrast, say, to monogamous societies, the idea that they're more violent is, no one disputes that. Yeah. It's like it's an anthropological, sociological, and psychological truism. And it's also one that's been, it's not like the left has been promoting polygamy. You know, so it was well, the article surprised me, to say the least.
Well, yeah, but you made an interesting move after that, which ties this all together, because you did a little checking on the phrase in the archives of the New York Times.
Well, the whole point to me was, if I could take Jordan out of the equation and I could make it into the New York Times wrestling with itself, I was pretty sure that the New York Times would have some record of having used the phrase enforced monogamy at some point. And so I went to the search engine and I put in, quote, enforced monogamy, close quote. And sure enough, there were two relatively recent references within the last 20, 25 years, both of them positive. One, I believe, coming out of evolutionary theory in Drosophila, where it's a less common term in evolutionary theory, but it has leaked into the evolutionary literature. And the other one coming from Afghanistan, where you have polygamous marriage, and that leaves too many violent young men with nothing to do, and that can be useful if you're conquesting other lands, saying, well, you have no wife here, but there's territory over there. And this is exactly, the New York Times was celebrating the idea that in a culture that was at that stage in its evolution, enforced monogamy was something that went hand in hand with women's rights, because of course having
which is the classic argument.
Having fewer violent men with no romantic prospects is in general good for the safety of women. And so the whole thing
which is actually my point.
Well, I know, I know. But the point was, can I take Jordan out of it and say the New York Times is wrestling with itself and not fairly? And this is the great danger, is that that finger is on the scale. Now, the other thing is that that particular journalist first was talking with Brett well before talking with you, and then Brett sent this journalist to me. And by the way, I don't think that we should not talk about the name of the journalist, since the journalist is certainly using your name, and the idea, so it's Nellie Bowles, and I found her engaging, charming, very quick, intelligent. The thing that I didn't appreciate, and I got fairly far into my discussion with her, and I was off the record, is, she began with the gambit, well, of course I'm going to be running your tweet on James Damore, which, went viral and was widely misinterpreted, and again in a deliberate fashion, which my tweet was responding to somebody saying, if human resources, somebody else from Google tweeted, if human resources won't do something about this, then, they're going to have trouble on their hands. And I was like, okay, you're telling people to run to human resources because James Damore is looking at big five psychometrics for personality and asking the question, how do we increase the accessibility of Google to female coders? And whether you agree with his technique or not, I think that was clearly his point. So the idea is, I'm going to bring up this tweet that has been widely mischaracterized of yours, Eric. And what became clear was, she had the idea that she wanted to find the men's rights activist community. And, she said something about, well, you're MRA. And I didn't even know what that meant. So I said, NRA? I thought it was National Rifle Association.
Right.
And she's like, men's rights activists. I said, what? And so we had this.
Well, that was just you being disingenuous, because of course you know what men's rights activists are.
Right, well,
secretly, you are one.
Okay, yeah. But the point would be, it's like, you believe in human rights, yes. Well, men are human, so you believe in men's rights, and you believe that one should be active, so, at some level, it's a reserved term for people who are very often kind of veering a spectrum of people who are talking about bad aspects of family, law versus people who are downright misogynists.
Right.
And I was just aghast, which is like, why are you trying to shoehorn me into this pre-existing thing?
Well,